everyone. We're back with the third episode of Women in Work Why It Matters, brought to you by the International Center for Research on Women and Feminism in India. We're your hosts. I'm Purnima.
Hi, I'm Nilanjana.
And today we're going to talk about the informal economy and its relation with women and their work. So, Nilanjana, I've always wondered what exactly is the informal economy and who are these informal workers that we talk about?
Thanks, Purnima, for this question. I think all of us sometimes grapple with the idea of informal economy. It's very complex and it's very vague, and we often use it very commonsensically. Now, based on what I've read and what I've worked on, I believe that informal workers are all those workers who do not have security of jobs and no access to social security, such as maternity leave, pension, insurance, and paid leave.
Yes, and as for informal workers, they can be a part of the unorganized sector. For instance, construction workers, domestic workers, seasonal agriculture workers, street vendors, and daily wage laborers. But they can also be part of the organized sector, such as contractual security guards in universities and banks, contractual ayahs and nurses in hospitals, contractual cleaners in schools, etc. Thus, it is the absence of a fixed tenure or social security that defines informality and not the place of work. Informal economy actually comprises of all of these workers.
Absolutely. In fact, most women in paid work in India and all over the globe actually are usually informal workers. In fact, 75% of women workers in India are informal workers. These workers are extremely vulnerable because they can be fired from their jobs at any point of time and have few fallback options. As a result, it's also quite difficult for them to organize and voice their demands, even in situations of extreme exploitation and violation, be it income or job loss, sexual harassment, or unsafe working conditions. To discuss all of this in greater detail, we have with us somebody really amazing. We have with us Dr. Neha Wadhawan, who is our esteemed guest today. Now, Neha works at the International Labour Organization and is based at the New Delhi office since 2018. She is National Project Coordinator of the Work in Freedom program at the ILO, which is an integrated development cooperation program focusing on preventing trafficking of adolescent girls and women into forced labor conditions, especially with regard to domestic and garment work. She is a political scientist by training and holds a PhD in international politics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her research interests center around issues of labor mobility, gender, and citizenship in South Asia, and she has carried out extensive research on gender and labor migration with a focus on domestic workers in South Asia over the past 15 years. She has also worked with many UN agencies as well as Government of India and Nepal in different consultant capacities to inform policymaking on socio-economic development, labor migration, and women's work. Welcome, Neha. Really, honored to have you with us today.
Hi, Nilanjana. Hi, Purnima. Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here to talk to you about women's work.
Thanks, Neha. So without wasting any more time, let's just move directly into some of our key questions and key areas of inquiry today. So, the first question that I'd like to discuss with you is about why, despite so many insecurities and challenges in informal work, why do most of the women in India and around the world, end up in informal work? Why do you think this happens?
I think if we look at the structure of the economy in this country and in the developing context at large, a lot of work opportunities are actually available in the informal economy. These are low-skilled, low-paying jobs, and often women find opportunities of work only in these sectors, right? Now, I think there are demand and supply challenges here that we must consider. There is a very high demand for decent work opportunities in India. But we also see that there are barriers to accessing decent work and sustainable livelihoods for women, which are more when you compare them to men. Now, when I say decent work, I'm referring to ILO's definition of paid productive work in conditions of freedom, equality, security, and human dignity. Now, in terms of the supply side issues, I think it's important to think about the important role played by patriarchal social norms, right, in defining how women engage with the labor market. And on top of it are layered issues of identity and culture, which we can see manifesting in different ways, often in discriminatory practices, which result in differential access to education, skills, employment opportunities, and then stereotypes around what women are good at and what they are not good at, which then defines the demand also into certain sectors. On top of all of this, I think unpaid work plays a very important role in keeping women from seeking employment. Now, let me take the example of, the issue of mobility outside the home, the community, and the village. When it comes to women, is restricted and negotiated, because of their gendered positions. And in this situation, if I can pick the example of trafficking, right, that which is something that we've been working on for many years now. The question to ask is, why do we use different standards for men in comparison to women? Because male migration is actually seen as more acceptable, right, compared to women's migration for work. The dominant discourse on anti-trafficking actually denies any agency, right, to women as workers and treats them as victims at best. So, what we can see also then in terms of the measures, right, to protect women from being trafficked, we see, we see efforts such as village level registration and surveillance, right, which may protect women, of course, from meeting unscrupulous middlemen, but they also may prevent a woman facing violence at home or in the community from being able to escape that situation. So I think it's very important to see that when we talk about encouraging women to participate in the labor market, and we think about schemes and policies and interventions, they could actually have the opposite effect if they are not really, factoring in what the gender norms are and what the results could be, which could be very different for men when it comes to comparing them to women. I hope that answers your question.
It does, Neha. Like Nilanjana mentioned earlier, and Neha, we've also talked about this in our earlier episodes as well. Women make up a significant amount of informal workers. And in the informal economy, which also includes the gig economy, they're often deprived of their worker rights. I mean, look no further than the recent case of Urban Company, suing its own women workers. So, Neha, I wanted you to talk about some of the key challenges and issues that informal women workers face and how, they were aggravated, particularly during COVID.
Okay, where do I start? Well, I think, the very nature of the informal economy is such that it is actually sans benefits, right? When you compare it to the formal economy. And this means, to a very large extent, the absence of social security benefits. Formal workers have access to ESI, PF, right? So there is some kind of safety net which exists for formal workers, which is absent in the case of the informal economy. Now we see that even when schemes are available to women workers to informal workers rather, we see that women rarely access these schemes or can benefit from these schemes. And again, this sort of links back to what I was mentioning earlier, right, about the design of these schemes and interventions, which might be well intentioned, but sometimes they end up actually leaving women out or leaving them behind, right? So I think that's really important to consider. A very, I think, large challenge in the informal economy is actually being able to identify, who is working in the informal economy, what is the data around these sectors, and then this directly impacts policy making on this, right? So if I take the example of domestic work, trade unions have been asking for a long time, right? Organizations of domestic workers have been demanding a comprehensive law for domestic work. Now, such a law will actually help their work being recognized, help them being recognized as domestic workers, and then provide protection, right, against violations that they can face as workers, as well as provide them with a safety net in times of crisis or need. Now, this is something that we have seen has been a long-standing demand, right? But we can also see now, with coming to COVID, that in sectors where this protection didn't exist were then therefore much more vulnerable, right? Um, and the lack of numbers and the lack of reliable data on these sectors, on who constitutes these sectors, what are the different minorities, what are the different marginalized communities in this country that are actually absorbed in these sectors that are low skilled, low paying, actually then impacts the kind of crisis response that can also be there, right? Now, I think on the outset, let me also say that this was an unprecedented challenge faced by governments. And if we go back to when, the pandemic sort of broke, there was very little that we knew about the COVID-19 virus and how it will spread and what will be its impact, right? But we did see that some of the lockdown measures that governments took across the world, not just in the Indian case, did meet with a lot of criticism because of the way they were implemented, or the I think the unintended impact they really had on the informal economy. Now, coming to India, I mean, I think in the reportage that we saw around the pandemic, we've seen this migrant worker crisis really, which sort of was staring at us in our faces. And some of us who've been working on migration studies for a while have been saying this, but I don't think it had actually caught the attention of policymakers in the way it did, right? So I think while schemes like the One Nation, One Ration Card, and other interventions by the government are very welcome, but it remains to see how they will be implemented and how the very nature of informal economy is perhaps going to prevent a proper implementation of these schemes. I also say this because I think the nature of the informal economy is such that women workers, or even male workers, they switch sectors. So a construction worker today could be a domestic worker tomorrow. And because of the nature of the informal economy, which absorbs and pushes you out from one sector into the other, how do these schemes, which are sector specific then, right, really benefit workers? So I think it's important to think of schemes and of interventions which again factor in the conditions that we are dealing with and some of the structural constraints that we see staring at us in our face. Now, I can also say this, that within the informal economy, I think there were differences because there's so much of legislation on the construction work sector. There was some sort of a safety net, and there could be an outreach to construction workers specifically because of that. It remains to be seen how many women construction workers actually benefited from these schemes, right? But at the same time, I think because there was not strong legislation available, or because there wasn't thought put into, or enough thought put into perhaps creating certain safety nets, we could see the pandemic actually destroy livelihoods, right? Now, women workers have reported non-payment of wages, they've reported job loss, and they've also reported how they've had to go back to work in a situation where the return to work conditions are unilaterally imposed by employers, right? We had a recent report that was published as part of our ILO program, which talked about domestic workers having to face this completely unilateral imposition of conditions of how sanitization should take place, what are the kind of what are the levels of cleanliness that have to be maintained, and the fact that a lot of these interventions can actually be detrimental to the physical and mental well-being of the worker herself, right, is not really something that has been factored in to some of the messaging that has taken place, and some of the, I think, the steps that have been taken place to really protect all of us against the COVID-19 virus. I think it's also important to note here that informal sector workers and domestic workers again are seen as carriers of virus, right? Because of the conditions they live in, because of the kind of working conditions also they deal with. But we can clearly see in this case that it was not really workers that took the virus perhaps to employers' homes, but it could have been the other way around, right? And I think it's important to really think hard about how much of vulnerability we are actually exacerbating when it comes to some of the living and working conditions of these workers going forward.
That's very, very important, Neha. Thanks so much for pointing out some of these really important points. And you mentioned the fact that, some of these workers over a period of time have been demanding certain kinds of safety nets, have been demanding certain kinds of protection. And the absence of these safety nets and protection actually led to complete breakdown of livelihoods or breakdown of overall survival conditions. Carrying on with this thought, I was just wondering that, over the last couple of decades or more, what kind of organizing have we seen, especially in the context of women informal workers? And what are some of the key issues that have been raised? Maybe they've also made some wins. There have been some achievements of this kind of organizing. Could you reflect a little bit on that?
Sure. 20 years is a long time period to reflect on, but without trying to make any sweeping remarks, I think it's been fantastic to see the levels of unionization today amongst informal sector workers and women workers, right? I think in the last 2 decades, we hear about these sectors. There's much more media reportage. A lot of that has been only possible because of workers themselves raising their voices, talking about their demands, talking about their living conditions, and asking for the freedom of association, asking for the right to collective bargaining being ensured. So I think in the last 20 years, I would say the increased recognition of the need for international labor standards to be applied across sectors of the informal economy, right? And efforts at the international level as well as at the local level to galvanize support, right, for these demands, I think has really been a big win. There is, of course, a lot to be done, but I think the sheer visibility that we see today is definitely a step forward. I think another important aspect is this whole debate on, the participation, the low workforce participation rates in the Indian scenario as well. And I think that again has brought attention of policymakers, of the governments to try and see what can be done to really actually. So I think research as well as I think movement on the ground, right? Workers raising their voices on the ground has really shed light on the need to actually create these safety nets. I think another big win, I would say, is the awareness around the importance of preventing sexual harassment and violence in the workplace, right? I think sexual harassment, we have a big win in the enactment of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, right? And the implementation of it as well, where within its ambit, it now includes domestic workers. So the workplace, which I think needs to be regulated. We have seen how trade unions have been very, I think, interestingly and through slow but steady work, try to activate local complaints committees and try and see how informal sector women workers can actually find their voices within these grievance redressal systems. But I think the question of violence in the workplace remains. A lot of questions around gender-based violence do remain, and how it actually impacts women's participation in the economy. So I think going forward, we have an uphill task in terms of building on the momentum that we've got in the last 2 decades. But I think our struggles have really just started, because I think we're a long way off in terms of being able to make social security for informal women workers a reality in our context. So I think there have been some wins, there's been greater visibility, but there's a lot that remains to be done.
I think you were right in saying, Neha, that you can't summarize what has happened in the last 20 years. But I think now that we've talked about laborers organizing, I want to talk about how sometimes their demands are to their employers and sometimes to the state. So, what do you think has been like the state's response to workers and their demands for better working conditions and social security? And what has especially been the impact of COVID-19 policy response on informal women workers?
Right. So I think it's important to consider the fact that when we talk about the state response, I think what has been very welcome is that there have been surveys initiated by the government of India to look at certain sectors where women, are employed in high numbers. So we do have the hope of more data emerging as we go forward, right? We've also seen how some states and workers' organizations in some states have really, I think, you know, led by example. And I'm saying this to give you the example of, say, the states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, where, unions and workers basically organized themselves and asked for compensation, which they received. Now, in other states, they didn't receive this compensation, one time compensation. But in these two states, they did. And they did so because, precisely because of the demands that were raised by these workers, right? Now, I think in terms of articulating demands to employers and to the state, there's one important aspect to consider. Because of the nature of the informal economy, informal workers tend to be employed by more than one employer sometimes, or they shift or switch employers, right? Now, this because the switching can be at very short time intervals, right? Uh, I think the overarching strategy has been to ask the state for protection as citizens, as workers. And because of that, we've had sector specific laws in the past that were passed, right, to protect workers within specific sectors and ensure decent working conditions to them, right, and wages and certain benefits. But what we must, I think, delineate here that what is it that the employer should provide and what is it that the state should provide. And I think it's for all of us to reflect upon collectively in terms of our strategies going forward. And especially, I think, again, bringing the COVID-19 crisis and reflections from this experience in. What is it that employers can do? And I think in the short term, the employers could do a lot. And we do hear exceptional cases of benevolent employers, reaching out to the workers. But the problem with such an approach is that these are very few in a large majority of employers that tend to be exploitative of informal sector workers, right? So I think there needs to be a balance in terms of what we ask from the state in terms of social security benefits. And should we be asking for these benefits as workers or as citizens of this country, right? And then what is the set of demands that we should actually target the employer for? So I think together with this, the fact that, and again, I think regulating the workplace is case in point, because we know how many women are employed in home-based work. We know how many women are employed in domestic work, right? Anecdotally, of course. We don't have concrete numbers. And I think the guesstimates that we have are, I think, pretty, I think I would say they're conservative estimates which are available to us, right? So in such a context, how do we strategize? How do we balance? And how do we see what must be demanded from the state and what the state can give, right? And the state can give you opportunities to skill, opportunities to break gender stereotypes, right? In terms of what sectors you manage to enter, opportunities of education, opportunities of actually having some kind of insurance or fallback option available to you if you lose work. But I think a lot of the working conditions onus does lie on the employer. And I think as we go forward, it's important to strategize, I think complementarily in terms of how these two approaches would work.
This has been really a fantastic discussion, and I'd really like to go on and on, but we are constrained by time. So we are nearly ending at the end of our conversation. And I'd just like to quickly highlight some of the very, very important things that I think you said during our conversation today. And I'd like to begin by saying that, you pointed to the fact that there are both demand side and supply side constraints, which often lead women with no other option but to enter informal work. So, be it your social cultural location, your lack of access to education and skills, or the gender norms that are guiding you, or let's say that lack of availability of decent work in the market, whether it is this or that, ultimately to earn a living you have no other option but to enter a space which, again, as you said, is sans benefits. So the nature of informal work is such that it is sans benefits or sans safety nets. It does not have the safety nets. That's a defining feature. And given this, often a lot of the organizing or the demand for decent work has been with relation to the state, because as you also said that informal work is also, the very nature of work is such that people are also often switching jobs. There is no one identifiable employer. You either have multiple employers or you're moving between jobs, etc. So often the demand is with the state to get some protection. But here again, as you very rightly mentioned, while there are certain very, very well intentioned and well designed policies and schemes, sometimes women are unable to access this because of the way this is implemented. And also because sometimes one doesn't know really who the worker is. It's difficult. I think the first step, as you mentioned, is the recognition of women as workers. I mean, if it's a domestic worker, first is to sort of count that person as a domestic worker, recognize that person as a domestic worker, and then she can access some of the benefits that are available. And in that, I feel COVID-19 has also been a kind of eye opener, because, as you said, like, due to the huge migrant crisis, and where a lot of people, men and women, migrant workers, and they are all informal workers, traveling back home because of the loss of livelihoods, loss of security, there's been a lot of attention on the conditions of work and on the kind of vulnerabilities they have faced. And so, something that researchers and even some of the policymakers have been talking about, now it's actually become something very central to our economy. And we do hope that going forward, keeping in mind the nature of informal work, we'll have certain kinds of schemes and policies which encourage women's participation in work, which encourage decent work, but which also protect women from these kinds of vulnerabilities and offer them some kinds of protections. I really like the fact that despite a lot of these challenges, we do see many women workers coming and organizing themselves over the last 2 decades, and there have been significant wins. And I think the state and also other parties, I mean, they have been involved in trying to create a more enabling space for women workers. So, be it the sexual harassment at workplace, that law, which also includes informal workers such as domestic workers, or be it the demand for applying international standards of decent work to the workplace. I think these are some extremely important issues that have been addressed or raised, and where the struggle is still ongoing. And I feel that what gives us hope is that uh, somewhere uh, there is, from the ground, a lot of recognition that we need to claim some of these rights as workers, as citizens. And also from the side of the state or employers, there's a recognition that these are real issues which need to be engaged with, and people are trying to find a path through this very, very complex domain of informal work and its attendant challenges. So I think I'll end it there today. Thank you so much, Neha. It's been lovely talking to you, and really very, very, very important insights that you have provided, especially in terms of some of the questions that we are still asking ourselves. That uh, do we demand rights as citizens or as workers? We want protection, but we also want encouragement to move jobs, to move from villages to cities, or cities to cities, or cities to villages. We want safe migration, not prevention of mobility. So I think these are some very important questions that we are all trying to negotiate. Over to you, Purnima.
Yeah, no, Nilanjana, I think you've summarized our discussion today, perfectly. But before we end today's episode, I would just like to take a moment to thank you, Neha, for joining us today and giving us the chance to talk to you. I think it was great talking to you today.
Thanks, Purnima, and thank you, Nilanjana, for again this opportunity to share some learnings from what I have seen in the field and the people that I have met. And I think it's really important to carry on these conversations. So it's been a real pleasure being here, and I look forward to having more of these conversations with you in the future and working together on some of these issues. Thanks.
Also, Neha, where do you think our listeners can find more information about your work at the ILO or the research that you've mentioned?
Purnima, I'll be happy to share the link of the project website that I'm associated with, the Work and Freedom program at the ILO, where people can access policy briefs, research publications, links to conversations on informal women workers that we have organized. And more information on the ILO itself in terms of the international standards and the conventions, work that me and my colleagues do for the betterment, of workers and to sort of uphold decent work. But I also have I have an academia.edu page, and I'll be happy to share that link with you, which has my publications and other information listed. And I'll be happy to respond to any of your listeners who contact me on academia.edu. Thank you.
Awesome. So, listeners, you'll find all of these links in the description of the podcast on your favorite streaming platforms, and you know what to do then. Before we go, just a small reminder, don't forget to subscribe, but most importantly, rate Women in Work, Why It Matters on your favorite podcast streaming platforms. The Women in Work, Why It Matters podcast series is part of the Rebuild, COVID-19 and Women in the Informal Economy project. The study is being carried out in Kenya, Uganda and India by the International Center for Research on Women with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the International Development Research Center. This podcast is brought to you by the International Center for Research on Women and Feminism in India. You can find out more about ICRW's work on their website, www.icrw.org/Asia, and find them on Twitter, on Facebook at ICRW Asia. You can also find out more about FII on www.feminisminindia.com or follow FII on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Feminism in India. Bye bye, and we will see you again in the next episode.